Good morning, students. Happy Thursday. Coming at you live from my basement. My wife is on a very important work phone call upstairs, so Miles and I were relegated to the basement. We got the doors closed, so hopefully we don't make too much noise to disrupt her. But it is Thursday, and like in Mr. Eline's email, today is Social Studies Day for Learning. We are going to keep with our Zoom schedule. So I've already met with 3 classes this week, and it was good to see all of you guys that Zoomed in, and we'll be meeting with 6th period this afternoon. But before we do that, let's start with today's lesson. Per this week's assignment, today we are going to be studying the first 5 presidents. So let's get started. By the way, there's Miles here for emotional support. All right, children, as you all well know, the first president of the United States was an individual by the name of George Washington. That should come as no surprise. But as I asked my classes on Zoom this week, I asked you, what did he do when he was the president? And nobody was able to answer that question. So when we're in school in elementary, we learn about George Washington. We know that he was a great general, but what did he actually do when he was the president? Well, the first thing he did was establish the third branch of our government, the judicial branch, or the federal court system. The federal court system is led by the Supreme Court, the highest court in all of the land, and he appointed the first Supreme Court justice, a guy by the name of, I believe his name was John Jay. I will double check that and let you know if I am incorrect, but I think that was his name. And today, presidents still appoint members to the Supreme Court because, wait for it, that's what George Washington did. George Washington knew full well that he was setting the groundwork for all future presidents. So he knew that everything he did would be studied and duplicated by future presidents. So you talk about a lot of pressure, knowing that you can't make a mistake, which is why he wrote down so few. He wrote very little because he didn't want to make a mistake and look foolish. Second thing that happened during George Washington's administration was the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. We talked a little bit about this in our U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights lecture 2 weeks ago. But when the Constitution was written, a lot of people thought that it gave the government way too much power. So James Madison, who we're going to hear from a little bit later in this lecture, wrote out 10 individual rights added to the Constitution, known as the Bill of Rights. And this next part about George Washington's presidency is a pretty neat story. So when he was the president, he went in between New York and Philadelphia. He didn't live in Washington, D.C. like the president does today because Washington, D.C. did not exist. So when he was the president, plans were made to create a nation's capital named in his honor, Washington, D.C. By the way, do you guys see that link down there? I was looking at history.com, lots of good information on the president. So if you're doing your research on your president for this week's assignment, check out history.com. Anyways, so the story goes, and I already see we're at 4 minutes, so this might be a long lecture, so I apologize. The story goes that we hired this French architect named Pierre L'Enfant. And I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name, but you might recognize his last name from one of the metro stops, L'Enfant Plaza, named after this French dude that was hired to build D.C. So he designed these plans for Washington, D.C. Well, just like a kid who gets mad in a game, he took his soccer ball and went home. He got upset, he rolled up his plans, he threw a temper tantrum, and he left. So people were looking around like, what do we do now? Well, this dude, this African-American guy by the name of Benjamin Banneker, and I apologize about the picture. It was not easy to find a good one of him, but this is a picture of him on a stamp. This guy, Benjamin Banneker, was a genius. He had a photographic memory, which basically means his mind works like a camera. So he saw the designs for Washington, D.C., and he was able to recreate them by memory. essentially saving the day and enabling the plans for D.C. to move forward. So that is President number one, George Washington, in a nutshell. Now, this next guy we have studied this year, a fellow by the name of John Adams. Now, I do feel bad for John Adams a little bit. Now, one thing I forgot to mention was that when George Washington left, he gave what he called what is it called when the president speaks at the end of his term? There's a word for it. It's like parting shots or whatever the case may be. I'm sorry that I can't think of it off the top of my head. But George Washington, it's a farewell address. That's right. In his farewell address, George Washington said, no matter what, guys, do not form political parties. They will ruin this country. And everybody was like, oh, yeah, George, we got it. You're number one. We will do whatever you say. Well, as soon as he left and John Adams became president, political parties were formed. Now, today, the political parties are Democrats and Republicans. Well, back in the olden days, they were called the Federalist Party and the Anti-Federalists. And the Anti-Federalists later became known as Democratic Republicans. You guys got that? So when John Adams was president, two-party system emerged. He became the leader of the Federalist Party. And as you're going to learn in our next president, Thomas Jefferson, he becomes a Democratic Republican. So fun fact about John Adams, he was the only one of the first five not from Virginia. As you all well know, he was from Boston, Massachusetts. Another interesting fact about John Adams is he was the only one of the first five presidents not to get reelected. And the reason he did not get reelected was because of that last one down there. You guys see that called the Alien and Sedition Act? Now, this is a really interesting law. So the reason I said a couple minutes ago that I felt bad for John Adams is he had to follow in the footsteps of George Washington. So you can imagine that kind of pressure, like this war general, this hero. And then, he was 6'4", he was well respected, and then here comes this loud, obnoxious 5'2" guy, John Adams, who, much like today, was only voted on by about half the country. So he passed this law helped pass a law called the Alien and Sedition Act. And the alien part of it meant illegal aliens, which is kind of ironic because one of the first things that President Trump talked about when he announced his run for presidency way back in 2015 was illegal immigrants. So John Adams was dealing with that same issue way back in 1790, whatever. There was a lot of concerns back then about Europeans coming into our country and taking over. And then the sedition part of it was really interesting. He hated that people badmouthed him in the newspapers. So he helped pass this law. The sedition part meant you're not allowed to badmouth the president. Well, that goes against our very own Constitution and the First Amendment with the freedom of speech and freedom of press. But I was reading today, they actually imprisoned like 20 people that were opposing or writing bad things about John Adams. So if you could imagine today, like President Trump throwing people in jail who were bad-mouthing him. So that became a very unpopular law, and that was the main reason that John Adams was not reelected. Now, speaking of John Adams, he was also the first president to move into the White House. This is the earliest known photograph of the White House. When he moved in, the White House was still under construction. So in 1800s, Thomas Jefferson ran for president for the second time. He was defeated in 1796 by John Adams, but ran against him again 4 years later. And in 1800, Thomas Jefferson became our third president. And the biggest takeaway from Thomas Jefferson's presidency, well, there was a couple of things. During the first three presidents, Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, there was all of this drama going on in Europe between France and England. And surprise, they were at war against one another, and they were both trying to